So it is important. How are we going to be able to educate this massive numbers of people, young people who obviously require education? What sort of education do we have to design in order for us to be able to give them the opportunity to shape not only this continent, but to shape the future of our planet? Scholarship is at the heart of institutions such as these ones, and we take scholarships very, very, very seriously. Knowledge is the basis of our future. If we do not take that mantra of taking knowledge as the basis of our future, then our future is going to be filled with poverty, is going to be filled with underdevelopment. We are going to be complaining about the same problems that we have been complaining about ever since the dawn of our first independent country, Ghana. So we need to nurture scholars who are inquisitive. You know, Einstein once said that the measure of how clever you are is not by how many questions you can answer. It is by how many questions you can pose than you can answer. And scholarship is really about that. Interrogating ideas, challenging ideas. And these ideas are everything. There are no holy cows. You know, for example, what does it mean to be an African? Very important question that we have not adequately answered. And it's even more complicated because this continent has the highest diversity ratio on the planet. There is more diversity in the continent of Africa than in all other continents that are outside it. Very, very important. So the issue of identity is much more complex. When you go to China and you see 1.23 billion people, identity is easy. You know, it's the largest ethnic group in the world. The Han, who are the majority of China, make 96% of the Chinese population. So their identity formation is absolutely easier. Ours is very complicated. And how are we going to craft it if you as scholars do not assist us? You know, there is the concept of Africa rising, the concept of Africa as the next growth frontier. But will that come into being if our scholars are not engaged? Will that come into being if we continue to import knowledge and not be knowledge generators? Of course it is not going to be. So it is really up to us. The future is in our hands. We have all it takes to shape it. Let us shape it and not allow it to shape us to the direction that we do not aspire to be. Once again, to all our partners, the Minister and his team, the Department of Science and Technology, the HSRC, the Africa Institute, which is now part of the HSRC, the SACHI chair of TUT, and of course our own SACHI chair. SACHI means the South African Research Chair Initiative, which is an initiative of the Department of Science and Technology to basically create a center of excellence in an area. And for the case of Professor Landsberg, is in African diplomacy. Very, very important, given the fact that we have many, many countries and our dreams must converge. The city of Tshwane, the ICSU, which stands for the International Council of Scientific Union, Brand South Africa, our National Research Foundation, the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, the Kara Heritage Institute.
Written by so many years ago by Bertolt Brecht, In Praise of Doubt, where he says, I'm just going to quote 3 paragraphs. He says, "Praise be to doubt. I advise you to greet cheerfully and with respect, the man who tests your word like a bad penny. I would like you to be wise and not to give your word with too much assurance. Later he says, but the most beautiful of all doubts is when the downtrodden and despondent raise their heads and stop believing in the strength of their oppressors. And finally he says, therefore if you praise doubt, do not praise the doubt. That is a form of despair. So I suppose I'm in the right audience, after all. Because all we are trying to do together here is to find a way forward for our continent and try to answer the most intractable questions facing our people. Not only to locate South Africa in Africa, but to locate Africa in the world, to try and make the world see Africa differently. It is a special honor for me tonight to share some thoughts with you on the theme, South Africa in Africa, enhancing synergies for a united and prosperous Africa. Successive South African governments have consistently affirmed the inextricable link between South Africa's national progress and development with that of the rest of our continent. Our enduring unity with the rest of our continent is based on unbreakable ties of history, culture, and sacrifice, but above all else, it is based on an inextricable and common future. It is based on the awareness that our destinies are mutually interdependent. For each African country and region to be united, prosperous, and peaceful, all African countries and regions must be united, prosperous, and peaceful. Our reasoning for pursuing the socio-economic development of our respective countries and regions must be the same as that used by Mwalimu Julius Nyerere and others, who argued that their own countries would not be free until every part of the continent is free. And like them, we must move beyond words in pursuit of this vision of a united and prosperous Africa and engage in practical actions to demonstrate our unyielding commitment. Africa provided steadfast and principled support to our struggle to defeat the most monstrous regime in Africa, viewed by all Africans all over the continent as an outpost of imperialism and a bastion and bulwark of colonialism on the African continent. The defeat of the apartheid system assumed centerpiece to Africa's long-term strategy for peace, economic development, and social progress. Accordingly, South Africa's liberation guaranteed Africa's long-term stability and development and ensured that it ceased to be what Verwoerd had called a piece of Europe on the tip of the African continent. It constituted an act of fundamental negation of white racial and colonial domination, reaffirming South Africa's position as an African country that looked towards Africa, the motherland, first and foremost, for its own sustainable peace, prosperity, stability, and indeed survival. After all, it had always been the fundamental understanding of the South African freedom fighters that the African National Congress itself was born of the African people's common hatred for colonial domination and unyielding desire for freedom and national self-determination. Accordingly, our struggle for national liberation in South Africa was inseparable from the anti-colonial struggles taking place all over the continent. From the outset, therefore, our struggle bore a Pan-Africanist identity and carried on its shoulders historic responsibilities that stretched far beyond the South African territory. Madiba articulated this perspective during his first OAU address as Democratic South Africa's new president on the 13th of June 1994 in Tunisia, when he said, I shall quote extensively, "When the history of our struggle is written, it will tell a glorious tale of African solidarity of Africa's adherence to principles. It will tell a moving story of the sacrifices that the peoples of our continent made to ensure that the intolerable insult to human dignity, the apartheid crime against humanity, became a thing of the past. It will speak of the contributions of freedom, whose value is as measureless as the gold beneath the soil of our country, the contribution which all of Africa made, from the shores of the Mediterranean Sea in the north to the confluence of the Indian and Atlantic Oceans in the south. Africa shed her blood and surrendered the lives of her children so that all her children could be free. She gave of her limited wealth and resources so that all of Africa should be liberated. She opened her heart of hospitality and her head so full of wise counsel so that we should emerge victorious. 1,000,000 times, she put her head to the plow. She put her hand to the plow that has now dug up the encrusted burden of oppression accumulated for centuries, close quote. In the same speech, he proceeded further to say, and I shall quote again, finally, at this summit meeting in Tunis, we shall remove from our agenda the consideration of the question of apartheid South Africa, where South Africa appears on the agenda again. Let it be because we want to discuss what its contributions shall be to the making of the new African Renaissance. Let it be because we want to discuss what materials it will supply for the rebuilding of the African city of Carthage. One epoch with its historic tasks has come to an end. Surely, another must commence with its own challenges. Africa cries out for a new birth. Carthage awaits the restoration of its glory. If freedom was the crown which the fighters for liberation sought to place on the head of Mother Africa, let the upliftment, the happiness, prosperity, and the comfort of her children be the jewel of her crown. There can be no dispute among us that we must bend every effort to rebuild the African economies, close quote. During the past 2 decades, the liberated South Africa has sought to play this role so very well articulated by Madiba, to contribute towards the making of the new African Renaissance by supplying the materials requisite towards this all-encompassing effort. We seemed to grasp the new epoch of Africa's new birth, together with the rest of the continent toiling for the upliftment, the happiness, prosperity, and comfort of her children, which would be the jewel on her crown of freedom. The new South Africa would turn her sight towards Africa, investing human and financial resources towards peacemaking and the pursuit of sustainable development on the continent. We were among the foremost advocates for the development and adoption of the NEPAD program, firm in our conviction that this was the urgent item on Africa's united agenda. At the same time, we invested time and resources towards uniting the continent, helping to forge a united global political and economic agenda at a time when imperialism and the neoliberal globalization were further marginalizing and ruthlessly exploiting the continent. Neither our own global political and economic ambitions nor those of the continent as a whole could be achieved if the continent was divided. We needed urgently to unite the continent as a potent political force and an explosive economic market. Without a doubt, the imperialist forces would not sit back and watch the newcomer South Africa spearhead the campaign to unite the continent and thus rob them of their playground. We needed both to engage the beast and at the same time to collaborate with it in pursuit of our own goals and dreams. Subjectively, and whatever their criticism or shortcomings, a number of economic interventions right at the advent of our liberation have ensured that South Africa can play an advocacy role for the continent, so that whilst it needs foreign direct investments from the developed North, she, however, is not beholden to them for the resources she needs to finance her social needs, her post-apartheid democratic project, as well as the African project, as well as the African project. Regardless of our own challenges, we have retained independence in terms of policy and political outlook in the global arena, and this has enabled us to choose our global friends and allies without being bullied and dictated to by any single country or bloc of countries, and thus to champion wherever we participate the cause of Africa. For Africa to develop on a sustainable basis, we need 1, peace and stability, in order not to disrupt our own economies unnecessarily and scatter our human resources all over the world as refugees. 2, we need stable democratic states based on the rule of law and founded on the principles of strong constitutions which encourage political plurality. And third, we need a series of major economic growth and development strategies which would include infrastructure investments, adding value to our minerals in order to start exporting value-added goods and reduce reliance on commodity exports, industrialize our economies, and drastically improve intra-African trade, as well as trade with other emerging economies. And fourth, we need social development programs that invest in our human capabilities as a continent, particularly focusing on our young, in order to build and secure the future. Only these programs can radically alter Africa's relations with herself and the world, place her on a footing for sustained growth and job creation, and enhance her political power in the global arena. Steadily, South Africa has integrated herself into the continent, not only through political and peace efforts, but increasingly through investment and trade programs. Whilst our economy remains largely an exporter of primary commodities and an importer of manufactured goods, however, the past 20 years have also witnessed increasing exports to emerging and developing economies, particularly in Africa, with sub-Saharan Africa, including Nigeria, Ghana, and most SADC states, being the largest importers of South African manufactured goods. Trade, investment in, and tourism to Africa have grown significantly in the past 20 years. It has been estimated that South Africa exported about 300 billion rand worth of goods last year to the SADC countries and sub-Saharan Africa. Furthermore, trade and investment in as well as tourism from the rest of the continent has created and sustains about 160,000 jobs in South Africa. Whilst we can celebrate that our countries trade with their neighbors and the total value of intra-African trade is growing steadily, it must be noted that there is obviously a trade imbalance in favor of South Africa in terms of trade and investments. So if Africa is so vital for the South African economy, it should stand to reason that African integration, intra-African trade, and the overall growth and development of the African economy should be even more important. Furthermore, if African countries consciously prefer doing business with one another and set the rules for stronger economies to support and pull up the weaker in an act of economic solidarity, the continent's economy would grow even faster. Currently, many countries still prefer to award their infrastructure projects to companies and state-owned enterprises from elsewhere outside the continent, whereas many African countries do have the capital, human resources, and agencies which can also be harnessed to support localization processes as well as the creation of supplier sectors. If we did this, some African state-owned companies can be deliberately grown into global original equipment manufacturers and centers of excellence that can then be used to help pursue localization on the continent and build the African manufacturing capability. South Africa must continue to work with fellow African countries to grow intra-African trade and deepen economic linkages while reducing trade imbalances. Countries should collaborate on regional infrastructure projects, particularly on road and rail corridors, which can lower excessive transport costs to move goods between African countries. We should coordinate efforts to industrialize our economies and link value chains regionally. It would be a tragedy of historic proportions for which our children will never forgive us if we build African infrastructure without utilizing these to industrialize our economies, pursue localization, and create local supply sectors. We must build legacies on the basis of which we can connect the continent. We should consider catalytic Pan-African manufacturing projects similar to the Pan-European Partnership, which led to the formation of EPAS. Such projects could allow for more competitive manufacturing through increased scale and the pulling together of capital and technical expertise, with the positive impact of creating integrated regional value chains. South Africa's global political and economic ambitions are interconnected with those of Africa. South Africa needs to support their country. South Africans need to support their country's regional agenda and adopt a view that our duty to Africa does not start and end with our own narrow interests. Tourism authorities in other countries and regions should increase their marketing efforts in South Africa to attract more tourists to their countries, more South African tourists to their countries. South Africans must be exposed more to the continent than they presently are. The truth is that many South Africans know that they are in Africa, but do not know Africa, have vastly diverse people, and how we are common and yet at the same time diverse with these people. A broader Pan-Africanist view should be taken to be in our very national interest. In that way, we would not view the continent in terms of what we benefit from it in a parasitic manner, but above everything else, in terms of what we contribute to towards her renaissance, as Madiba committed us. In that regard, we will take our participation in the G20 and BRICS not as merely representing only our importance in global affairs, as well as among emerging nations, or what we can benefit from these bodies as a country, signifying narrowly that we are punching above our weight. We would take it to mean the responsibility we have to articulate and advocate, indeed to champion, an uncompromising but progressive African agenda. After all, South Africa has global political and economic ambitions that cannot be fulfilled by our lone acts, even if our BRICS and other friends can unite behind those ambitions. Ultimately, our global political and economic aspirations are interconnected with and are not parallel to or separate from those of the continent as a whole. Our global agenda to change the world's attitude towards Africa and make the world take us serious as a continent needs us to have the capacity to unite the continent behind and harness all the positive energies towards this endeavor. We cannot fulfill this historic role and responsibility if the peoples of the continent think we have a condescending attitude towards them or want their support for all manner of issues, but do not want to help them in their hour of need and do not respect the human rights of their nationals in our country, even those that are undocumented and who entered our country irregularly. The recent violence against African immigrants is an inexcusable and has shamed all of us. South Africans must resist national chauvinism and continue to espouse progressive African and international solidarity. We have a responsibility to be forthright in fixing our relations arising out of these experiences and to work vigorously with fellow African countries to share responsibility jointly to manage migration within the continent by undertaking both national and regional actions that diminish irregular migration, including that of asylum seekers, economic and undocumented migrants. No single country can bear the burdens of migration, especially of economic and undocumented migrants, on its own. However, whilst countries have a responsibility to fix their economies and minimize the incentives for their nationals to travel to South Africa at all costs, South Africa also has a responsibility, out of an African solidarity, to help build their economies in order to make our contribution towards the rebuilding of the continent, supplying, as Madiba said, the materials requisite for Africa's renaissance. The subjugation of the African continent over several centuries into a fragmented continent of weak states, trapped into exploitative and anti-developmental relations with the global trade system, cannot be undone by uncoordinated, individually conceptualized and implemented actions by African states. It can only be undone by sustained, coordinated actions between increasingly integrated countries and regions, acting in solidarity with one another, which see and prioritize regional and continental development and peace-building efforts, sharing a common perspective as to the future that we want. South Africa has made critical contributions in this regard and will continue to do so towards a better life for all and the Africa we want as envisioned by Agenda 2063. And I thank you.
So, Honorable Minister, allow me at least two directly from Minister's speech. I'm going to call on our ED. Start with the general one. So Professor Marwala and our Vice Chancellor is fond of reminding us that if prognosis and scenarios and predictions are to be believed, that within the next 50 years at the most, this continent's population could go up to 4 billion people. In fact, currently, this is the third largest continent in the world in terms of population size. China, India, Africa. That's the good news. Here is the bad news. China is one state. India is one state. Africa, Minister, has 55 countries that has to learn to speak with one common voice. How do we do that? That's one question. 55 states, 54 members of the AU. Two questions directly from Minister's speech. I heard Minister say, maybe not in so many words, but definitely it was there, challenging us. It's not only the West that should have a symbiotic relationship between practitioners and scholars. Africans also need it. How does South Africa build an African constituency if we want to play a leading role in championing the African Renaissance? Final question for now is, how do we go beyond the imperative of capturing the state in Africa and build an imperative for regional integration? Because for those who think we are just bashing Europeans, the one model that Europe teaches us, and that's why the EU remains the closest we have to a supranational body in the world. Germany and France became tired of war, and they started an integration project. What is the imperative that should get us to go beyond the nation state in order to integrate and go beyond cooperation? Because we cannot remain 55. China, I leave you with this scary thought. The Communist Party full-time members of China is bigger than the population of South Africa. At least 80 million people working directly for that party. Larger than South Africa's population. So, how do we compete? How do we set the agenda? How do we restore our agency and give meaning to the notion of African solutions for African problems. Minister, I thank you. I thank you for raising the bar. I thank you for setting the example. I thank you for your time. And it's now my privilege to ask our Executive Director, Dr. Magwe, to hand over the gift on behalf of the university and all partners. Join me, colleagues, in thanking Minister once again. Minister, please. Dr. Walla, please join us up front, Minister. And then we're going to, colleagues, take leave of Minister, and I hope you fully understand. Thank you. I would prefer behind the orange, or in front of the orange. I'm not biased at all. Join me once again. We fully understand. We appreciate it, Minister. We will debate the input further. You are most welcome, and we appreciate that. Let's take a 5-minute breather. We shall return.
Is or should be in the contemporary period. This topic which I've been requested to address is one which I think we've grappled with over a period of time, Africa's development challenges, except that this is now to be tackled in the context of the new Agenda 2063, which was adopted this year by the summit of the African Union, the summit which took place in January in Addis Ababa, for the first time adopting what some have described as a continental blueprint for the transformation of the continent. I myself have had occasion to interact with the directorate in the African Union responsible for drafting the agenda, and have also, in my job, which I'm actually quitting, Chris, the current position, or the position I've effectively left as director of the Institute for Economic Development and Planning. I also did help to convene directors of national planning commissions and agencies across the continent to have a conversation with the African Union around Agenda 2063. But I still maintain my own independent view and critique of the agenda, and I'll be sharing some of those with you, set within the context of the historical trajectory of African development, and particularly of our quest that has, I think for now, run over the last 600 years of trying to turn the table of underdevelopment on our continent. And I will argue that the quest for development is a long-standing one, and the roots of the contemporary challenges which we are confronted with actually go back to the period of the slave trade. For those of you who have read authors such as Walter Rodney, you will find in the convincing thesis which he developed arguments properly documented, which underscore the fact that prior to the onset of the slave trade, Africa was at par or even ahead in certain sectors with the rest of the world. And before the onset of the slave trade, the African continent compared favorably in all development indicators with the rest of the world, which explains his thesis that essentially the seeds of African underdevelopment were sown 500, 600 years ago when the slave trade triumphed on the continent. And he was to demonstrate with empirical evidence the ways in which the workings of the slave trade not only created wealth in Europe, particularly for the dominant classes that were the drivers of the so-called transatlantic trade in human beings, but simultaneously led to the underdevelopment of parts of the continent. Looking at Upper Guinea, for example, he was able to show, and other historians were to join him subsequently, historians who actually invested themselves in seeking to calculate as accurately as possible with the scientific tools available to them the numbers of people who were lifted out of the continent, and which resulted, in some cases, in the immediate collapse of local economies, complete with all of the consequences associated with a massive and shocking depopulation of parts of the continent. So even as we talk today about Africa rising and the population dimensions, the so-called youth dividend that we are going to be reaping if we get all of the elements right, we should remember that 600 years ago, in fact, Africa was faced with a severe problem of depopulation that was contingent on the development of the slave trade. Now, as though the slave trade and its impact, adverse impact, was not sufficient, what subsequently followed in the wake of the abolition of the slave trade, which abolition itself, in fact, was symbolic not of the Christian goodness of the abolitionists, but the economic exigencies of a transition to an industrial revolution in Europe, and to the emergence of modern European industrial society, that effectively human labor on that scale was no longer necessary for the working of plantation economies in the Americas and Europe and the Caribbean to produce the raw material that fed the industrialization process that was unfolding in Europe. Effectively, what replaced the slave trade following the abolition was essentially what was called the legitimate trade. Legitimate only because it didn't require the trafficking of human beings across the Atlantic Ocean, but also riddled, just like the slave trade, with terms and relationships that certainly sustained the underdevelopment, the seeds of underdevelopment that had already been sown by the slave trade. So if the slave trade effectively depopulated the African continent and disoriented local economies in a way as to enable them, as to compel them to both lose their internal coherence and become dependent on a logic that was external to those economies, to lose their autochthony, as it were, the autonomous, internally propelled capacity to transform themselves. What was known as the legitimate trade, a trade in African commodities, was in fact to establish the framework for the beginning of a process of plunder that continues to this day. The plunder of raw materials of various kinds, legitimate in very ridiculous ways. The merchant princes of the Niger Delta, for example, of Nigeria, as Kenneth Dike was to document, were encouraged and sometimes compelled by the use of the gunboat by the British, the Portuguese, and others to exchange palm kernel for mirrors and trinkets. Mirrors, cheap trinkets. Even Chinese manufacturers will be of superior quality when you compare what the Portuguese were trading off the coast of the Niger Delta. And for those so-called merchant princes of the Delta who controlled the trade in commodities in the hinterland of what is today Nigeria and all of the Bight of Biafra and parts of Upper Guinea, essentially, those of them who refused to cooperate in the legitimate trade were compelled by force, military force, to trade on terms which were dictated. So legitimate only because human beings were not being shipped, but riddled with all kinds of inequalities and disadvantages. And, as I said, setting the stage for plunder. And with all of the challenges that were involved in conquering the hinterland, the legitimate trade, in any case, so-called, was to pave the way for the onset of colonial rule. The colonial imposition, which, as we all know, amongst other consequences, resulted in the balkanization of our continent and its fragmentation, consequences with which we are still dealing to this day. It also was to lay the stage for the neo-colonial exploitation of our continent. So you can see why in Walter Rodney's thesis, it was his PhD thesis that got published into a book, it was easy for him to conclude that in order for Europe and subsequently the Americas to develop themselves, Africa had to be underdeveloped. And this dialectic is one which sets the broad framework and parameters for much of what we are still dealing with today. And I take my time to go into this history because quite often we engage contemporary development questions on our continent as though history did not count. And I want to suggest that history does count. The consequences of actions which were taken 500 years ago still live with us to this day and are felt not just on our continent, but in all of the black world, which essentially fits into all kinds of stereotypes and even racially grounded and based theories about the inability of the black person to achieve. And you just need to look at Haiti, and then look at Sierra Leone, then you look at Somalia, then look at Liberia, and see what Africans are doing to themselves, as though the Africans just woke up one day and decided that they are going to simply impose all kinds of pain on themselves. This structural framework that has set the parameters for much of the action which leadership has attempted to take on our continent is one which is important to keep in mind. And I talk of a structural framework mainly to underscore that there is an element of compulsion that is involved in it. A compulsion which, even if it does not involve the use of force, certainly entails an orientation in a certain direction. An orientation which almost predetermines the parameters for policy intervention and action, almost like tying your hands even before you take the first step to do anything. You can see the dilemmas that are involved in all of this. Now, of course, in the face of the multitude of powerful forces arrayed against the African continent, making possible the slave trade, the so-called legitimate trade, the colonial imposition, and some of the neo-colonial machinations which we have seen, Africa, of course, has not simply been passive. Africans of successive generations have attempted to exercise agency in different forms, beginning from resistance to the slave trade, stories which we don't read in the literature. It's as if Africans, I mean, even a friend in Harvard who started the encyclopedia on Africa, almost convincing African Americans that Africans were collaborators, continental Africans were collaborators in the slave trade, and they were as guilty as the white merchants who came to buy human beings off the coast of the continent. Essentially, again, out of a failing to understand that, in fact, spectacular cases of resistance against the slave trade comprised an important part of the story of that inhuman trade. And if we take other episodes of resistance which have marked an important part of our history, we will see a repeated assertion of African agency. But that agency was also not simply expressed only on the African continent, but in addition, outside of the continent. And particularly relevant for us today as we mark Africa Day, begin the process of marking Africa Day, is the birth of Pan-Africanism, of contemporary Pan-Africanism, which interestingly actually began in the Americas and the Caribbean. Henry Sylvester Williams, to be joined subsequently by all of the others, and activists like Marcus Garvey, who essentially decided that in the face of the travesty that they were confronted with, they needed to organize the African world in order for Africa, first, to reclaim its history, and secondly, to hold its own destiny in its own hands. People like Marcus Garvey, more activists than the Henry Sylvester Williamses and others, were in fact to organize concrete projects of a return to Africa movement, and attempted to set up African businesses and enterprises that will promote trade between the Americas, the Africans in the diaspora, and the continent, preparatory to a grand return to the continent in order to push a project of African Renaissance. That story is very familiar to all of us. Sometimes perhaps we don't understand it as an element of the exercise of African agency and of the resistance. Because in any case, the slave trade, if it did not do anything to the continent and to the peoples of African descent, it damaged the psyche and the psychology of people, of people who essentially were treated as subhuman, who were told that they had no history. Reputable historians, otherwise knowledgeable, were to set up very ridiculous parameters for determining whether a people had history or not. And in the case of Africa, Hugh Trevor Roper and others operating out of the London University system were to suggest, almost in justification of the humiliation and inhumanity imposed on Africans, that Africa had no history before the arrival of the European, and that whatever existed on the continent was really little more than a series of gyrations of people, these gyrations of people who really had not yet had an encounter with history and therefore entered into civilization. All of these were to be challenged by a crop of nationalist historians who meticulously, through oral tradition, reconstructed the story of the African continent from antiquity to the contemporary period. I will not have time to go into that, but the exercise of agency expressed in Pan-African consciousness was one of the more powerful moments of the African resistance. The conscientization of Africans and the politicization of the African, the assertion of African identity and the dignity of the African, which ultimately was refracted back from the diaspora to the continent and to begin to fire the resistance to colonialism. The resistance which was ultimately to lead to independence, Tunisia, the Sudan, Ghana, and the story of the 1960s, Sekou Touré, and the historic no vote that led to the crumbling of the French Empire, at least in terms of its political edifice. Most unlikely site where a resounding no, was to be mobilized against the idea of a French Commonwealth, which Charles de Gaulle, the then president of France, canvassed heavily amongst the nationalist politicians of Francophone Africa in order to encourage them to remain part of the motherland, that motherland being France. At a time when, of course, the French also needed numbers as well as territory in order to have a claim to being a big power in the post-1945 global order, where Pax Britannica was beginning to be replaced by a Pax Americana in world affairs. The independence nationalists, of course, also made a significant commitment to the ideal of Pan-Africanism. There was no unanimity. People had different perspectives of what Pan-Africanism could and should mean in the context of the Africa of the post-war period. The more radical groups among them, such as Kwame Nkrumah and his associates, organized in the Casablanca bloc, were to argue that Africa would not really succeed in carrying the logic of resistance and the reassertion of its own identity and dignity to a logical conclusion if it did not overturn